this. I've been trying to make that piece for 5 years, or rather dreaming of that piece for 5 years, so it's a real honor to be able to finally bring that to the public. So I've geared this talk mainly for students. I'm going to talk a lot about the challenges that I've experienced both in my life, but also in being an artist, so that, and some of the devices that I've kind of figured out on how to survive as one. Just because I honestly really wish that I had seen something like that when I was a community college student back in Virginia. And that's where we're going to start. So from a context perspective, there's two bits of biography that I want to kind of just like lay down as a foundation. The first was I was born in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, which houses the largest naval base in the world. Every single area of the military is represented there. While my grandfather was in the Navy, both my mother and father were not, but I was surrounded by the military growing up. The second little bit of information is that I grew up a mile away from Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network. And that, the evangelical Christianity and the morals and traditions therein really also informed the way that I formed a sense of self growing up as well. And so when I figured out that I was gay and realized I needed to get out of there to kind of figure a few other things out, I ended up going up to New York to study. And I'm only going to really talk about one photograph from my undergrad, and that's this photograph. The photograph I made 20 years ago this past summer. It's a photograph of my parents. That's my mom on the right, Jackie, and my father on the left, Jeff. And when I brought this photograph into my junior seminar class, the crowd, the students started to buzz a little bit. I didn't quite understand what was going on or why they were so interested, because my mom is 6 foot and my father is 5'11", and I grew up in a family where my mother generally inhabited and demonstrated all of the gender roles that you would associate with the father of the family, and my father did the exact opposite. And that was just normal for me growing up. And so when a lot of the other students and my professors were unpacking this photograph as its relationship to the American Gothic painting and other types of representations of parental figures, I realized that there was something that I knew or I had a relationship with that came so easy and obvious to me, and that other people found interesting and provocative because it wasn't what they grew up knowing. And a question that I ask my elders a lot is, what do you know that nobody else knows? Or what have you learned that nobody else understands at a younger age? And so when I'm working with students a lot of time, I'll say to them, I'm going to continue looking at the world the exact way that I see it. I don't love what I'm seeing all the time in culture, but I enjoy the visual experience I'm having. What I love even more is when an artist or a filmmaker or somebody creating visual media takes my head and turns it and says, look here, go and experience the world this way. And I didn't know it then, but in many ways, when I brought this photograph in and I saw other people having that experience where I had taken their head and kind of turned it and said, what if the world looked this way, that I was onto something. And so this photograph and the project that this was made from, called Family Matters, kind of launched me on a career. I won a New York Foundation for the Arts grant. I started showing, I didn't get representation, but I started showing in group shows at pretty big Chelsea galleries in New York City. But there was one other thing that happened in undergrad that I want to point out that's really important if you're a student, if you're an artist, and that is, I went to school with this guy, Christopher Graves. And that's a photograph that he made recently in 2020 for National Geographic. And Christopher Graves understood at a very young age that nobody in the industry was going to come and kind of save us or create a world or a job for us. And so he started doing that right away and building community. And oftentimes when I was in an art program or when I was in film school, it was very difficult to not feel like you were in competition with everybody else, because everyone's vying for the same prize, for the same award, for the same grant money. But what Chris understood at a very young age was that we weren't in competition with each other, as one of the professors here said so eloquently when we were talking about this today. This is our community. And so if you're in school right now, look around. These are the people that you're going to be tracking with possibly the rest of your life as you're showing work, as you're competing for prizes. They're going to be on the jury while you're submitting your work, or you're going to be on the jury while they're submitting your work. And Chris really has kind of just like taken everybody that was in that class on the ride that he's been on, because he's created the context. And the first way that he did that was, one of the reasons I started showing in Chelsea galleries in New York City was because Chris decided, you know what, I'm gonna rent out one of these spaces and I'm gonna put on a show. And while we didn't get a ton of attention from that, it gave us a resume line item that had us showing in New York galleries. And I just want to point that out. He's going to pop up a couple other times because he kind of changes my life. We're on the third iteration at this point. And so I really tried to make it, try to stay in New York. But I didn't seem to be finding any jobs that really made any sense. And so I went back to Virginia because all the pictures that I was making were of my family and they were in Virginia. And so I went back into the world of being with a bunch of military men. And at this point, I started dating them. And this is not a gentleman that I dated, but you have to remember we're in a moment where Don't Ask, Don't Tell was still very much in play. And where I grew up, the biggest gay bar that existed was in Norfolk, Virginia, and it was across, you had to park across the street from it, and there was a 2-lane highway. And it was in a more economically depressed neighborhood, and everyone knew that it was a gay bar. And so probably every 3 times that I went, somebody would be hit, and it was very obvious that somebody was being hit on purpose as they were crossing the street. On top of that, the military was sending people out whenever they wanted to get people out of them, kick them out, and they were taking photographs of the license plates and then running those against the information that they already had. So it created this feeling of surveillance. All the military men were completely freaked out and closeted. And so I started looking at the policy and I was like, well, what exactly is this policy about? If you can't ask and you can't tell, then what is the visual signifier that is getting the person in trouble? Because that's all that's left there, right? This is such an antiquated, thank God, way of thinking about this at this point, but is it a walk? Is it a talk? Can I make photographs of it? So I start photographing gay, closeted military men and women and straight men and women. The straight men and women were a little bit more freaked out to be part of the project because they didn't want to get kicked out of the military either. And this was something, if we go back to what is the thing that is your personal experience that you can mine, what are the questions that you're asking in your head that can inform an artistic practice? These are the questions that I was asking in my personal life. That then informed a whole bunch of pictures and ended up getting me, I won a Best in Show prize for a thing, a big competition in the state of Virginia, and it gave me my first solo museum show at the age of 25, because I knew something, I could look at something and articulate it for a population that wasn't thinking about it, if that makes any type of sense. And I was really, really interested in trying to figure out something else about the military that I couldn't quite put my finger on. And I made this picture right before I got into my graduate program, which I ended up going to San Francisco for. But right before I left, I was living with my parents at the time, trying to save money, and we got a phone call from one of my childhood friends' sisters saying that 2 men have arrived at the front door, and this literally is just like in the movies, and they've told us that Josh has been killed during his first tour in Iraq. And this was one of the guys that I played tackle football with. And so me and my parents got in the car and we drove over, and we were there still as the Marines were standing, were with the family. And what I watched, I was 27 at this point, what I watched was everything just kind of start to fall apart, right? I hadn't experienced this level of grief before, but I hadn't watched my friends also experience this level of grief before, and their relationship to that was much more complicated than mine, because this is Stephen, and Stephen is Josh, the gentleman we just saw. Let me go back. This is Joshua Sticklin, and this is Stephen Cook. And that's Josh's best friend. And Stephen's older brother, also a Marine, these are all Marines, was my best friend. And we would pass each other in the doorways of our childhood homes. But Stephen really didn't have anything to do with me because he kind of sniffed out I was gay, and that made him kind of uncomfortable. His older brother didn't when we were growing up. But at Josh's funeral, something shifted. And we ended up meeting up, I think it was 6 months after the funeral, he came back in town. And he just kind of started gravitating towards me. And we were having conversations about what was going on. And one day, we decided that we were going to rent a car and drive from Virginia Beach, Virginia, to Rochester, New York, where Patrick, his older brother, my best friend, was living at the time. And so we got in this car, and somewhere along the eastern shore of Virginia and Maryland, I asked Stephen how he was doing with Josh's death. And it was a totally wild moment because the car at that point had been flooded with light, and I asked the question, and before Stephen responds, we kind of go into this cave, this shadow cave, because the trees had just kind of filled out around us and it had blocked the sun. And during the duration of that cave-like experience, Stephen proceeded to tell me how he was feeling. And then right before we came out of that cave, something changed. And he realized that he had just revealed this deep emotional truth that he had not told anybody else. And he said, I haven't told even my girlfriend this. And essentially, this man had been built to go onto the battlefield to kill somebody, but he hadn't been built with any tools to deal with what happens when someone dies on that battlefield, and you have to then redeploy. And he was about to redeploy, and he was terrified because the image of Superman had been basically cracked. And so I said, do you mind if I start making some photographs of you? Because the emotional intimacy that has developed between the two of us is very similar to the emotional intimacy that has developed between your brother and I've been trying to make photographs of that for years, and I've been failing. And he said, sure, that's totally fine. And so I make a couple of pictures, and this is my first semester of graduate school, and I bring it into my advisors, and one of my advisors was a very well-respected critic for a major publication, also a gay man, and in my sort of semester review, he said, let's be honest, you just want to have sex with all of these men. There's nothing more to this. And I was really taken aback by that comment. And it took me a very long time to get over the comment, actually, because it felt so reductive that I wasn't allowed to have more complex relationships with men outside of just a sexual one, especially one that we've kind of held up as a trope within gay male communities, but also as to kind of like pinnacle of American masculinity. And so what I didn't realize, but intuitively pursued, was that he actually gave me a gift. He gave me a gift because I realized that in photography, I was the one both making the images and I was editing the images about these individuals. So I was writing that story. And so I started to ask a question. Is there a way that I could flatten that hierarchy a little bit? How can I bring their story or their visual images into this project to kind of balance it out? And so I made this picture of my best friend, Patrick, on the right, and I told Stephen what this person in my graduate program had said to me, and he said, well, I'll show you the pictures that I made in Iraq. And so on the left is Stephen's photograph of a man sleeping on a bunk. And I would have made that photograph if I would have been deployed with them. I love this photograph on the left. And I said, do you mind if I integrate those into the project? And he said, they're all yours, here you go. And so in the V gallery, which is the gallery that's focused on my veteran and active duty projects, you see a project called He Opened Up Somewhere Along the Eastern Shore. And it's a weaving back and forth between the pictures that I'm making of them while they're back in the world of being a civilian, mixed with the images that Stephen is making while he's being deployed in Iraq, both before and after Josh has died. And then he also shows me this incredible video that is also on display called In the Green Zone, or I've titled In the Green Zone, November 2007. And in this video, it is one Marine teaching another Marine how to waltz while they're deployed. And what I didn't realize was that when you're over there, you're not allowed to have any type of copulation, even if you're in a mixed kind of situation. But you're also dealing with such a level of death that I can see why somebody would be wanting to do that. And so when I saw this video, I was like, oh, this is about being touched and being held in a place in which you're kind of at the most extreme part of the human condition, or one of the most extreme. And so this is what the show looked like. I finished the project in 2009, and lo and behold, at that point, Chris Graves had continued, and at this point, he had opened up a gallery in New York City. And so he gave me my first show in New York City. And these are images from that show. And while I'm making that project, which is ostensibly at the end of the life cycle, right? Because at a certain point while I'm making that, Patrick decides that he's going to leave the military and he moves into being the veteran. I'm wondering if this is the end, where do these men get built? Like, how did they learn, and how did they disappear into that body? And I remember that when Patrick left, he was a year ahead of me in high school, and he went down to South Carolina to boot camp. And he came back from boot camp. We kind of couldn't see each other for 6 months, and we literally could see each other, but we couldn't really have a conversation because his world, he had dramatically shifted into the Marine, and I didn't know who that was anymore. And he couldn't kind of see, it's like our values and morals and ethics, and that's not a value judgment on what he had become. It just was, we were two very different people. And so I was like, when does this start? And so on a trip back to Virginia, I said something to my dad, and he said, well, you're never going to believe it, but my closest friend at work, her son has just become a freshman at the same high school that all you boys went to, and she has asked him to join one club so that he's not involved with, he has an after-school activity. And he chose ROTC, National Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, which is the military preparatory program, in high schools across the nation. And so I go and meet Sherrod for the first time, and his mother, Angela, and we totally get along. And what I find out is that Angie is raising Sherrod mainly as a single parent. And she's super excited that there's going to be this other male individual, basically, in his life, after I say, would you mind if I photographed you for a few times? And then eventually I got ahead of myself there. A few times, and then I said, could I photograph you maybe for the rest of your time in high school? And he says yes, and she says yes. But that first time that I made a photograph of him, when he went to go and change into his ROTC uniform, Angie turned to me and said, every single time he puts on that uniform, I no longer see my son. And it tipped me off that this was about looking at a young man disappearing into the uniform. And so I start making this project in 2008. And in that time between, I graduate from my master's, and I got to get a job because even though I am, for all intents and purposes, successful in my career at this point and having a solo show in New York City, it's not really producing all that much income. And I'm up in San Francisco, and one of the biggest employers is Gap. And so I take a low-level job at Gap thinking I'm just going to pay the bills. And about 9 months into the job, I get a phone call from my mother very early in the morning, right as I arrive at work, saying that we've found your sister and that she died last night, suddenly. And I go home back to Virginia to bury my sister. And I should say, we didn't do this up ahead. There are going to be conversations about suicide. There are going to be conversations about racial violence during this talk. If you need to get up and leave to take care of yourself, please do so. So we do the funeral, and my sister was also queer. And at this time, in September 2010, if you remember, the media started paying attention to the fact that LGBT people seem to commit suicide at a very high rate. And as a response, the community came back and said, we're gonna make a project, Dan Savage and his husband, the It Gets Better Project. And so when I get back to San Francisco, I have a standing business meeting with my vice president. And I say, have you seen what's going on with this It Gets Better project? And he said, I have no idea. And I said, I don't really want to talk about business right now. I think it's important. I want to show you this. And so I show him what Google has made. And at that point, Google was the only company that had made a contribution to this project. And he's in tears after watching Google's contribution. And I said, Gap needs to make one. We know we hire a lot of LGBT people across the country, but what if somebody watched Gap's contribution and they walked into a store in the middle of America? Excuse me. Oh. Didn't expect that. And they met a friend. And he said, okay. And I said, I want to make Gap's contribution to the It Gets Better project. I had never made a film in my entire life. But something told me that I needed to do it. So he said, great. And he turned around, and I kid you not, he picked up a red phone, and it was a direct line to the president of the company. And that was on a Friday, and on Monday morning, I got a call saying that it had been approved and that I was in production on their contribution. And we're just going to watch a small clip of that.
Growing up, all I wanted was to fit in and be like everybody else and quote-unquote normal. And looking back, I realized that I made myself really unhappy living this way because I was living my life based on other people's standards. And their opinions of me and my fear of their opinions of me were more important than what I thought of myself.
I remember there's times walking down the street and people just stop and stare and just try to figure out if I'm a boy or a girl. But to me, I just keep walking and I just brush it off because in the end, I know who I am and you know who you are.
I remember growing up having a hard time dealing with who I was. Several times I thought about running away from home and even thoughts of suicide.
There are many of us who are in the same situation, who might have the same story, and just when it seems that things are so rough and things will never get better, it will absolutely get better.
There was a reason I had never made a film before, and that was because my sister was a filmmaker. And I wanted to make the space so that she had her thing and I had mine. But when she died, it felt like a torch had been passed. And so I made this as a love letter back to my sister, and it just so happened that it got released by Gap, is the way that I thought about it. But then it taught me, and also the response to it within the company taught me, that there was this whole other way that I could actually fund my life. And so 9 months later, I moved from an entry-level position to senior middle management and became Gap's storyteller. And I did that for the next, for as long as I could tell stories about jeans. At the same time, I'm still flying back to Virginia to make every basically 3 months to photograph Sherrod and his journey from freshman to senior year in high school. And we're getting closer and closer, and at one point I'm seeing Angie, his mother, get so frustrated with trying to teach him how to drive that we put the camera down and I go into the same parking lot I learned how to drive in and taught him how to drive. And that's the intimacy of the relationship that's going on. And I can't remember when, but at a certain point, Chris Graves calls me and is like, what are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm finishing up this project. I think I maybe had like a month or two left before Sherrod was going to graduate from high school. And he said, great. I think I'm going to start a publishing company. And I was like, awesome. And so he published what would become I Slowly Watched Him Disappear, my first monograph. And at this point, Chris's day job was at the Guggenheim photographing their collection. And he's a mover and a shaker, and he knew how to get things done. And so this book is now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, New York City. The list just keeps going on. And I'm just saying this again because no one else came in to publish this work or to kind of like really elevate it. He keeps coming back to the people that he went to school with, and that community keeps growing. And at this point, Chris Graves Projects, his publishing imprint, has spun off because he is, and I don't know if this is still true in 2022, it was true in 2020, he is the only African-American photo book publisher that has their own publishing company. And so he spun that off, and he has a line that only publishes African-American photographers. And pictures, images, they either trap us or they liberate us. And there's so many ways that when I was growing up back in Virginia and I was going to the Central Library and I was learning photography through looking at photo books, I really only saw a limited view of what LGBT people looked like. And obviously this has expanded, thank God. But I think about that with all populations that are not in positions of controlling their own narratives oftentimes. And he is one of these people that is opening that gate so that there's a broader set of representation all over the place. But I digress. I'm really impressed with what he's done for the community in general, the larger community. So these are spreads from the book. And I followed him from 2008 until 2012. And I'll tell you a little side thing that I let kind of dangle in the book, but I think it's kind of important to talk specifically with students. Sharad was on a path. We grew up in a military town. The military marketing is intense. It appears that it's the only option, and that is on purpose. So much so that I thought I was going to go into the military at a certain point. And so I don't have an image up here, but you can see it in the galleries. Just like in He Opened Up Somewhere Along the Eastern Shore, I said, Sharad, can you how did this, it came about because he had his notebook out, and I saw that his notebooks were these really fine drawings of ammunition and the kind of like mechanics of the way a gun operates. And I asked him what that was about. And he said to me, I'm just like, I want to build machine guns and I want to like design them and that kind of thing. And I was like, I don't know if you're going to get that in the military, but what if you went and got an undergrad degree in something that would kind of like help you that way? And I don't say this in the book, but he doesn't go into the military. He ends up actually going, and when I went back for a second master's degree, we both graduated at the same time. He got his bachelor's and I got my master's. And I think that there's this relationship to protagonists that is really complex when you're the conduit for someone else's story. And that second master's that I'll talk about in a second was in journalism, and there's this really curious relationship where you have to keep a distance. And multiple times I've really walked across that line because the person, by intervening, how do I want to say this? I didn't really want the military marketing machine to kind of overtake him, I guess, is how I'll leave it in that. I wanted him to make the decision knowing all the information that was possible. And again, I don't have any direct position either way that it's bad to go into the military. I just want you to make the decision to go into it with your eyes wide open. So, mid-2014 comes around, and I'm really frustrated with the fact that the individuals in the work that I'm making are mute, because all I'm making in the art world are photographs. And so that's why I go back and I was like, I think I want to be a documentary filmmaker instead. And so I applied to Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and get into the documentary thread, and immediately am sent down here to Los Angeles to be the virtual reality intern at the Los Angeles Times. And this is the second time that I've really intervened, because for the 15 years that I lived in San Francisco, I lived in the neighborhood called the Tenderloin. It was on the bleed of the Tenderloin and Nob Hill. That's one of the more economically depressed neighborhoods in the city. And so I was interacting with homeless individuals all the time, and a woman told me her story that she would rather give herself to a group of men so that she could have protection and sleep through the night than to wake up in the middle of being assaulted. And that completely destroyed my heart when I heard that story, and I'd never thought about the implications of being a woman and being homeless. And so when I came down to Los Angeles and I saw that Los Angeles was in the same exact crisis in a way as San Francisco, I asked if I could make a virtual reality piece where the homeless women could tell their story about what was going on. And I got partnered with a LA Times reporter that's her beat. First name is Gail, I'm blanking on her last name. She's a great reporter. And we did a piece together. I filmed with women in Whittier and on Skid Row. And in the last meeting, when I was supposed to interview somebody, I could tell that the woman that was supposed to interview, she was hesitant to come out. And what was going on was she was literally being bullied by the man, and there was physical component to that. And so she came out, and we did the interview, and she was terrified. And I said, okay, we're done, and I'm done being a journalist. We were far enough away. The aid worker that was with me had taken the man somewhere else. And I said, do you want to leave? And she said, I don't know how we're going to get out of here. And he's not going to know that I'm leaving. And if he realizes I'm leaving, he's going to run after me and probably try to kill me. And I said, well, why don't you meet me at the front gate? Because we were in one of the canals where you see oftentimes tents. I said, why don't you come up to the gate, and I'm going to act like I'm going to get you food, and I'm going to come back with that food. So go and get all of whatever you can bring with you. It's probably just going to be a bag. And you get in my car, and we'll go to wherever you want to go, and I'll drop you off. And we did that. And I share that story because it has set up this constant tension for me around this relationship to the protagonist and me as a maker, whether I'm a journalist or a documentary filmmaker. I just think that we have a responsibility to the human in these situations. But when we're in that journalism space, we're expected to have such a level of distance. And as I get older and I keep making these types of stories, I just don't think that's okay. I think we have a responsibility to the other person, especially when we're going to be broadcasting their story to hundreds, thousands, possibly millions of people. And that leads me to John. I met John 2015, I think. I hate the dark. I'm terrified of it. I was invited to go and meet him 5 times and turned it down the first 4 times. My sister loved to terrify me in the dark. So this was not an exciting or interesting thing for me at first. And then I met John, and everything kind of changed. And John at that point had been living in the dark for, let's do the math really quickly, 6 or 7, 8 years. He'd been in there for a while. He hadn't, when I first met him, he hadn't started drawing on the walls. And you think, oh, there's a person living in the dark, like, wow, that must be like a totally interesting thing. And after about 5 minutes, it becomes pretty normal. So from a storytelling perspective, it wouldn't hold the audience for that long, right? The novelty of it goes away fairly quickly. But then I sat with John and I started to learn some more things about what was going on with him. And when my sister had died, and some other things that happened in my life, my inability to process the trauma that had happened in my body caused something to shift in my immune system. And I started to have eczema from the top of my scalp to the bottom of my feet. And sometimes it was my whole body. And I spent many a weekend locked away in my apartment because I was embarrassed by how I looked. I was in pain. I'd wake up and the bed would be bloody because I had scratched myself to that level during the night. And so when John told me this story of being isolated and secluded in his apartment, I was like, I don't know that story, but I know my version of what that looks like in my body. And I was introduced to this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And it completely opened the whole nugget for me. And I learned about a process called EMDR, which is used extensively with veterans who are suffering from PTSD, trauma survivors who are suffering from sexual assault. Honestly, if you've got a repetitive thought that you can't get rid of, find an EMDR therapist. It's kind of an amazing process. And I started to wonder about how I could possibly tell John's story through the lens of a series of traumatic incidences that he had experienced in his life. And then suddenly the darkness that John was living in became this much larger metaphor for the darkness that a lot of us are walking around in. It just so happens that in his was literally materialized, right? And so I started to make what would become my thesis film from Berkeley, How to Make a Pearl, and that's on display today in the John Who Lives in the Dark show. And I make this film, and I'm thinking about Caravaggio because of all the chiaroscuro lighting chiaroscuro that's happening in his home because of the way the flashlight is kind of moving around. These are John's wall drawings, and the story behind this of how he moves into making this level of art is he was given a drug called mexilatine. Mexilatine is the liquid form of lidocaine. And it did something to him, which caused him to kind of stop a series of repetitive and very painful memories from his past and from Vietnam. And you learn about that if you watch How to Make a Pearl, which is in the gallery, about what specifically that was about. And to still his mind, thank God he did this because the VA told him it was going to be 6 months, and it was eventually 9 months before they got a therapist out to him. He started drawing on the walls, one circle at a time, and he started counting the circles. And it was just enough for him to stop the repetitive thoughts and come back to the present. It's mindfulness meditation technique, essentially. And it saved his life because he could not stop them and he was ready to exit. Or at least he says he was close to it by. Which when I saw those, I immediately thought of these. And so I started in my mind to piece together this film. And when I graduated, thank goodness, The Guardian bought the film because I wanted the film to be available for free and to the broadest public as possible, and they helped me do that. And I have a really great relationship with The Guardian and the documentaries division specifically, and so they said, what are you working on now? And this is a photograph of me and my father back when I was making the Family Matters project. And I said to them, or let me tell you what the question was, and that is that a couple of years after my sister died, my father informed me that he was gay. And it wasn't a rainbow sunshine coming out party. It was a very complicated conversation, and it continues to be a very complicated relationship to today. And prior to that, my dad was my best friend, and that friendship was kind of skewered for a variety of reasons. And so I was really asking this question of what is a parent's responsibility to a child. That was just what I was thinking about in my life. And I meet Nick. And Nick is the partner of my best girlfriend, Amanda. And I'm asking Nick, because he's a wise, very steady gentleman. He's a Marine. He's a former Marine, excuse me. I ask him, tell him what's going on with my dad, and I say, what would you do? He gives me some advice, and he says, if that was bad, or if you think that's bad, my stepfather set me on fire when I was 6 years old. And I did not expect that, obviously, and was quite overwhelmed. But it started a series of conversations that I think it lasted about 9 months, sparse, about whether or not he would ever be willing to tell that in a public fashion. And so when The Guardian asked me what I was working on or developing, I pitched them what would become A Childhood on Fire. And A Childhood on Fire is screening in the V Gallery, which is the other show I slowly watched them disappear. Because what I didn't realize was that Nick would connect what I was working on now, which were trauma narratives and resilience stories and post-traumatic growth, with what I had been working on with all of the military men. Because the sections in the film deal with his stepfather trying to kill him, And then he implicates the state, who lets the stepfather off for this act of violence by not charging him, and Nick ending back up in this family to deal with an incredible amount of emotional and psychological abuse. And then, when he survives his, I don't know if it was the first, I don't think it was, firefight in Iraq, when he's a Marine, he realizes that this isn't the first time someone's tried to kill him. And then when he comes back and sees the documentary No End in Sight, which kind of opened up how we had been kind of, sold a bad bill of goods about why we invaded Iraq, he realized that all the way up to the commander-in-chief, the father figure of the country, he had also been basically treated as disposable. And so it connects this long investigation that I've been on between these two populations. In the back end of how I made the film, or what I was thinking about, is I started to read a lot of phenomenological texts about fire and the way to think about how could I think about fire in a different way. I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and started to think about what is the letter, how could I make this as a letter form as a film? And I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of visual imagery. So what could I do with the interview itself? And so I started to think about the interview as the testimony, as a witness testimony. And what could the interview setups themselves be almost locations that tell you visual information or get you in the scene of the story that Nick is telling. So in this first scene, in the first part of the film, Nick tells the story on one of his kids, on one of his child's beds. In the second part, when he's trying to build up his body to fight off his stepfather, we're in the gym that Nick now runs. It's a CrossFit gym. When Nick is realizing in the film that what's going on with his military service, we're down in the basement, which actually kind of has this bunker-like feeling. But then what do you do with the images of the kids? Because if images both liberate us and trap us, and in some ways I also think films can be almost like spells, how can I do something that when the kids come on screen, they're never ever implicated or they're protected from the fire that's going on with the father? And so all the images with the kids, they're always in or by a body of water. And so I'm going to show you one of the scenes from the film, and just a warning, this is one of the racial violence scenes.
One of my first memories was waking up early and playing in the house while my mom and stepfather were in bed. My brothers and I were playing around the oven or playing with the oven, and my stepfather must have heard that or thought that was going on, and he woke up and came out, and as a form of punishment, he decided to show us what fire would do, and he set us on fire. I don't remember being afraid or scared or thinking like, what's going on? This is crazy. This was just my life. We were frequently made to like hold burning matches in our fingers, or there'd be some other forms of punishment that were really abusive. So yeah, he lined us up in the house. It wasn't even outside. Watching him strike the matches and light my brother on fire and hearing him scream and cry, and then that happening to my next brother. And I remember the pajamas that I was wearing and how when the flames touched the shirt, it was like plastic melting, that like, you could smell the stench of the material and the skin, and it was so significant that like the burn, the pain it was almost like there was no pain in it. When it was done, being consoled by my brothers and me trying to console them, and then just really like moving on with our day. For some reason, I feel like it was a weekend. And relatively soon after that, I was back in school. And obviously, my teacher discovered the burn. Almost immediately after that, of course, I was taken out of my house and away from my mom and stepfather, and so were my brothers, and we were moved into foster care. Magnus, you and your brother are the most important thing in my life. I will always love you, no matter what. Remember, you are a human being first. See everyone the same way. The connections you make with other humans are the most important investment you will ever make. Please don't forget to connect to something greater than yourself.
And the film continues on, alternating between the stories that Nick experienced in his childhood and as he grew into an adult, with these lunch notes that Nick tucks away in his kids' lunches, which are kind of just, well, he says it best at the end of the film, he's attempting to give them a sense of self, a sense of self-love, before other people get inside of their head and try to tell them who they are. While I was finishing this film, while I was pitching that film to The Guardian, the BBC called me and said that they had seen How to Make a Pearl, and were preparing a big package, which in the journalism world means photographs, reportage, other types of things. And did I have any stories in the Middle East, the MENA region of the world, Middle Eastern North Africa, that I'd like to tell? And I was like, I don't, I'm so sorry, but this is an amazing call, thank you so much, or meeting. And they said, well, we'd like to work with you, so see if you can find something. And so I send out and try to find something, and all of the leads kind of come back cold. And they call me up while I'm shooting, actually the kids scene that you were just watching. I was on location with Nick and the family, and they said, we have a gay man and a lesbian in Amman, Jordan, who have attempted suicide because they were put through gay conversion therapy. And we have a gay conversion therapist that's willing to go on camera about why they're doing what they're doing. Would you like to direct that film? And they didn't know anything about my sister, really, and they didn't know anything about the fact that I had grown up in Virginia and had essentially put myself through gay conversion therapy by becoming an evangelical Christian and then exiting the church. And so I said, yes, it'd be an honor to tell that film. And so I finished production on A Childhood on Fire, and I flew out to Amman, Jordan, and made my first foreign language film, which is titled Tomorrow Will Be a Better Day in an Unknown World. And that's a line from the lesbian protagonist's suicide letter. And that film goes online July 2020, which brings us to essentially the beginning of the pandemic. And I go back into the dark with John to make what is now becoming John Who Lives in the Dark. And I think, because we're at 5:58, I'm gonna stop right there because the fruits of that labor is on display in the gallery. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm learning the system. Thank you so much, Jason. That was, I was very touched, actually. So before we break and go over to the exhibition, I'd like to just open the floor to see if anyone has any questions on the presentation or for Jason in general. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
With his biological mother?
Yeah, Nick, the mom, does he still have the relationship with the mom? I know he went.
They have conversations.
Okay.
I don't, there has been a development with his biological father, but it's not really my place to go into that. That's a lovely development. Yeah, he chats with her, but yeah, it's complicated.
I'm hearing all these stories about other people's severe trauma. How did that affect you yourself as not only a journalist, but as a person?
It's intense. I was in Santa Monica last night in conversation at Chris has now opened and co-founded an NFT business that's done quite well called Quantum. And I was chatting out there and we were talking about this topic specifically. I have a therapist and we talk about it, and there are moments where this is very tough work to do, but also if someone's gonna give me the honor and privilege to be the conduit for their story, I'm gonna treat that as a sacred experience in and of itself, and do what I need to do to show up as clean and clear as I can into that moment, because we're walking into, I'm the person that's holding the space to walk into their hell with them, and in many ways it's my job to also walk them back up from that hell after the process. So I do the self-care work that's necessary to do that. The other day I was preparing the open captions for both of the films, and I hadn't watched the films in a while, and it was an emotional experience to watch both How to Make a Pearl and A Childhood on Fire back to back. And it really made me think about the emotional space that I was in and what I was processing at the time while making the work, and having to shield myself from my own emotional experiences so that I could be strong enough to hold that space with the protagonist that I was in dialogue with at the time. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm a robot when I'm making the work. When A Childhood on Fire was on its festival run, Nick went with me to one of the screenings, and he came up for the Q&A, and somebody asked him, what was it like working with Jason? And he said, which I was so honored, he said, part of the reason why I was willing to do what I was willing to do was that he met me each time. He met me in the emotional space that I was in. So it wasn't just a one-way receiving of what Nick was saying. We were in dialogue, and I was sharing about where that was echoing back inside of me, what had happened, right? How I was dealing with loss, how I was dealing with Josh's death, all the way back when, right? So it's an exchange of energy, I guess I would say. And I think that when we try to steal up and we don't let that flow happen, that's when and let me say it this way, when I steal up and I don't allow that flow to happen, that's when it becomes kind of problematic. And in so many ways, I almost think of the eczema as me stealing up and trying to hold without letting that experience kind of flow out. Like, I haven't had a full body eczema thing in probably 5 or 6 years at this point, because I've learned ways to kind of like get that out of my body. And I didn't say this at the end, but it's a good point to kind of drop into that. Really thinking about what the first part of this book goes into. James Hillman was the head of the Young Institute before he died, and first part of this book talks about how Freud, when he was developing psychoanalysis, was using various literary theories. And that's what you would do, is that you would kind of like, I'm going to condense this a little bit, but almost like, okay, tell me what was going on. Oh, that sounds almost like a crime, like a thriller. What if you told that story, the story of your life, as like a thriller or something like that, right? So how can you use fictional literary theory idea or literary ideas to conjoin the two things that have been severed, right? So like when my sister died, nothing made sense. There's the before and there's the after of when she was here and when she wasn't. And I couldn't figure out how to put those pieces back together. And I'm sitting with Nick, he was struggling to put the pieces together of how this person, when he was 6 years old, could allow another person to set him on fire. And that person was his parent. And so how do we tell the story so that that through line keeps going? Because that's what happens with a traumatic incident. It cuts the story in a really curious way. And so I think about the films as one way, and that part of my job is to kind of create that connective tissue, right? I'm not the therapist, but how can I do that as the storyteller, as I repackage the story and put that out to the broader audience? So it's not exactly the answer to your question, but in some ways that's a healing process for me as well.
Any other questions? Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming and sharing your work. It is a profound experience to go on the journey with you, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, everyone, thank you for coming. We have the exhibition just down the hall on your right. I'll let you see my face while we do this before I mask up again. The gallery is right down the hall is John Who Lives in the Dark, and that's the Boone Family Gallery. The building next door, the V building, on the other side is the V Gallery, where I slowly watched them disappear, is the second exhibition. And so there will be refreshments and catered snacks over right by the Boone Gallery. So come stay for some reception and enjoy the show. Thanks for coming.